The man didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that stayed with people afterward. Not the words themselves, not even what happened next. It was the way Douglas Harrington said it, in French, to his associate sitting across the table, while Maureen Osei-Baptiste was standing right there, holding his empty water glass, like she was a lamp, like she was part of the furniture. Elle ne comprend pas de toute façon. Regardez-la. She doesn't understand anyway. Look at her. His associate, a younger man named Thierry, who would later say he felt sick for not speaking up sooner, laughed nervously and looked down at the breadbasket. That table was on the 4th floor of Chateau Belmont, one of those Ottawa restaurants where the prix menu started at $240 and the lighting was soft enough to make everyone look like a painting. It was a Thursday evening in late November, the kind of night where the snow outside made everything inside feel warmer than it deserved. Maureen set the water glass down. She smiled the way she had trained herself to smile, over 23 years in fine dining, with her eyes steady and her hands completely still, and asked if she could bring anything else before the next course arrived. Harrington waved her off. She walked back toward the service corridor, and she did not let herself think about what he had said. Not yet. If you've ever worked a room like that, you know the rule. You keep it behind, you close the wall. You put the words in a box, you close the lid, and you do not open it until you're in the car or in the shower or sitting on the edge of your bed at midnight. You save it for later because you cannot afford it right now. There are 6 other tables, and 4 of them need something, and the kitchen has a 12-minute window on the duck confit that you are not going to blow because some man decided his dinner companion needed to hear his opinion of you in a language he was certain you didn't speak. Maureen Antoinette Osei-Baptiste was 51 years old. She had been born in Montreal Nord. Her mother, Céleste, had come from Kumasi with a sewing kit, a French-English dictionary, and the specific stubbornness that only women who have crossed oceans tend to carry in their spines. Céleste had worked alterations at a dry cleaning shop on Rue Jerry for 11 years, before she had enough saved to open her own place. She worked the counter herself until she was 72. She never once complained about her feet. Maureen had grown up watching her mother move through a world that was constantly trying to make her smaller, and refused to shrink. That was the word she used when Maureen was a teenager, and asked her once how she did it. Je refuse de rétrécir. I refuse to shrink. French had been the language of Maureen's childhood, of the kitchen table, of the grocery store, of the schoolyard arguments and the Sunday dinners and the phone calls to cousins back in Ghana who thought it was both hilarious and impressive that she spoke it with a Montreal accent. She had grown up speaking it the way most people grow up speaking whatever it is they grow up speaking without thinking about it, which it's to see completely. She had also grown up speaking English and Twi, and a working amount of Haitian Creole that she'd picked up from neighbors and never quite let go of. Douglas Harrington had been speaking French to her, like it was a private room she was locked out of. She let him think that for another 40 minutes. The evening had started simply enough. Harrington had arrived at 7:15 with his associate Thierry, and a woman who was introduced as his legal advisor, Simone Leclerc. Though Simone didn't speak much and spent most of the meal looking at her phone beneath the table. Maureen had seated them at table 9, the round one near the east window that the regulars knew to ask for, and had taken them through the evening's menu in English, as she did with all new guests until she had a sense of what they preferred. Harrington was the kind of man who held the menu without reading it and asked what the chef recommended in a tone suggesting he already knew and simply wanted confirmation. He was in his early 60s, with the careful grooming and slightly too confident posture of someone who had made enough money that people had stopped disagreeing with him in public, roughly 15 years ago. He ordered the tasting menu for the table without asking the others. He sent the first wine suggestion back and accepted the second, with the air of a man who considered this a fair and reasonable thing to do. Maureen had served men like him before. She had served them for 2 decades. She knew the species. She also knew, within about 30 seconds of hearing him speak to Thierry at the beginning of the meal, that Douglas Harrington's French was fluent, colloquial, and native. He'd grown up somewhere in Quebec. She'd have guessed the eastern townships from the particular rhythm of it. And he used the language the way people use a tool they've owned their whole lives. She understood every word he said. From the moment he opened his mouth, she didn't show it. She had learned a long time ago that there was a difference between what you know and what you reveal. Her mother had taught her that too, though she'd said it differently. Garde ça pour toi jusqu'au bon moment. Keep that to yourself until the right moment. The right moment Maureen had come as the first moment. It was during the second course, a seared scallop with celery root puree that the kitchen was particularly proud of that season, that Harrington said. The first thing that made Thierry go quiet. He had been describing a property deal in Gatineau to Simone. The numbers were large. Maureen refilled the water glasses and said nothing. Then Harrington glanced at her and said to Thierry, still in French, that he didn't understand why they kept hiring people for front of house who looked like they should be doing something else. The something else was left implied. Thierry picked up his fork. Simone looked at her phone. Maureen said, in English, I'll let the kitchen know you're enjoying the scallops, and moved to the next table. Behind the wall, she was very still. In front of it, she was also very still. She had been doing this long enough that the two versions of herself had learned to move in the same direction. She served the third course. She answered a question from table 14 about the cheese selection. She brought a second basket of bread to table 11. She glanced at table 9 periodically, as she always did, and registered the rhythm of their conversation without entering it. At one point, between the third and fourth course, Harrington said to Thierry, still in French, still with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been surprised by a room, that the service was adequate, but that you could tell they'd lowered the standards recently. He said ils prennent n'importe qui maintenant. They take anyone now. He said it the way people say things they believe are private. Thierry, said Douglas in a low voice. Harrington shrugged and reached for his wine. Now here is the thing about Chateau Belmont that most guests didn't know. The head sommelier, a man named Bertrand Houlet, who had been there for 16 years, had a policy he'd implemented back in 2019. He hired for language. Not because the restaurant demanded it. It didn't, officially, but because Bertrand believed that a room like this one, in a city like Ottawa, where half the tables on any given night were occupied by diplomats, civil servants, and visiting professionals from a dozen countries, deserved staff who could move across linguistic lines without making guests feel like they were doing the guest a favor. Maureen had been hired, in part, because of the brief conversation Bertrand had conducted entirely in French during her interview. A conversation she had joined mid-sentence, without pausing, without switching registers, without making it a point. She had never mentioned it to Harrington's table. There had been no reason to. Until the fourth course arrived, and Douglas Harrington, in French, told Thierry that the woman serving them probably couldn't find Chateau Belmont on a map 3 years ago. Maureen set down his plate. She placed it with the care she placed every plate, precisely, without a sound. She straightened up. She looked at him directly, which was something she did not always do, and she said, Monsieur, j'ai grandi à 15 minutes d'ici, et je connais cette ville un peu mieux que la plupart des gens qui viennent dîner ici. Sir, I grew up 15 minutes from here, and I know this city a little better than most of the people who come to dine here. The table went quiet. Not dramatically quiet, not movie scene quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when something small and unexpected lands in the middle of a conversation, and nobody quite knows what to do with it. Thierry looked up from his plate. Simone's phone disappeared into her lap. Harrington's expression went through 3 distinct phases in the span of about 2 seconds. Surprise, and then a kind of controlled blankness that Maureen recognized immediately. It was the face of a man deciding how to respond to something he had not prepared for. She did not wait to find out what he decided. She asked, in the same even tone, whether she could bring anything else before the next course, and when no one answered, she nodded once and moved toward the service corridor. Behind the wall, Something anger before, and it never helped. She'd had anger before, and it never helped. This was something else. The way a room looks different when someone opens a window in winter. Sharp. Clean. A little cold. She'd held it together for 40 minutes. She'd done what she always did. And then she'd said one sentence. And the sentence was true. And she had said it without raising her voice or losing her posture. And now it was out in the world, and she didn't need to carry it anymore. She went to the service station. She drank a small glass of water. Bertrand appeared at her elbow. He had a way of appearing at people's elbows during difficult tables, which was one of the reasons people trusted him. And he said quietly, in French, "Ça va?" She said yes. He said "Scene." She said she knew. He said, also in French, that he was going to check on that table in a few minutes, if she didn't mind. That he had some questions about the wine pairing for the final course that required his personal attention. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been in service for 30 years and is very precise about what he considers an appropriate use of his time. She said she didn't mind at all. Bertrand Oulet approached table 9 during the 5th course, a beef tenderloin with a Madeira reduction that required very little improvement, and introduced himself as the head sommelier. He asked, in French, whether Monsieur had been satisfied with the wine selections this evening. Harrington said he had. He'd recovered his composure by then. He was polite. Bertrand said he was glad, and that he'd wanted to mention that Maureen, he used her name, was one of their most experienced staff members, that she had been with the restaurant for 6 years, and had trained in formal service in Montreal before that she spoke, if Monsieur was curious, 4 languages with professional fluency, including French, which she had spoken since childhood. There was a silence. Nothing. Harrington said nothing. Bertrand wished them a pleasant remainder of the evening, in French, and walked away. What happened after that was, in some ways, less interesting than what had already happened, and in other ways more so. Harrington finished his meal. He and Thierry spoke very little during the final 2 courses. Simone, who had been largely invisible for most of the evening, asked Maureen, in English, whether the restaurant offered a dessert tasting, and Maureen described it warmly and in detail, and Simone ordered it and seemed to enjoy it. When the bill came, Harrington paid it without discussion. He left a gratuity that was, Maureen noted, exactly 15%, the minimum of what could be called respectable, and not $1 more. The statement that made was not lost on her, but it also did not particularly wound her. A man who had built his evening around the assumption that she was invisible had just been made to understand that she was not. The 15% was information about him. It was not information about her. She cleared table 9 after they left. She stripped the linens with the efficiency of someone who has cleared 1,000 tables and knows exactly how many motions it takes. She went back to table 14 and answered a question about parking validation. She finished her shift at 11:40. In the break room, her colleague Destiny, who had been watching the situation from across the floor all evening, in the way that colleagues watch each other in rooms where things can go sideways, asked if she was okay. Maureen said she was fine. Destiny said what she'd done was smooth. Maureen said she'd only answered a question he hadn't asked. Destiny said that was what made it smooth. Here is what Douglas Harrington didn't know that evening, though he would learn pieces of it later, through channels he hadn't expected. Chateau Belmont had been quietly building a reputation in Ottawa's diplomatic and government community as the kind of place where discretion was built into the walls. The staff didn't repeat conversations. The management didn't share guest information. What happened at the table stayed there, with exceptions only for the kind of behavior that couldn't be overlooked. Douglas Harrington's Thursday dinner was not the kind of exception the management would have reported. Informally, however, people talk. And Ottawa is, for all its size, a city of networks and memory. Bertrand Oulet had been sommelier to 4 deputy ministers, 2 ambassadors, and 1 Supreme Court justice over the past 16 years. He had a great many colleagues at other establishments. He was not a gossip. He was, however, a person who occasionally mentioned things. Thierry Marchand, for his part, had left the dinner early the following morning for a flight to Vancouver. Before he boarded, he sent a text message to a mutual contact, a woman he'd known since business school, that said only, "Diener difficile here swore." Douglas was not at his best. The contact, who had her own long memory of Douglas Harrington's dinner table behavior, noted it and said nothing to anyone yet, but she noted it. These things have a way of accumulating. Not quickly, not dramatically. Like snow on a roof. Quietly, steadily, and then all at once. Maureen drove home that night with the radio on low and the heat turned up, and the particular kind of tired that comes after a long service, which is different from the tired that comes from other kinds of work. It lives in the feet and the lower back, and occasionally the jaw, from smiling, stained in a sustained and professional way, for 4 hours. She thought about her mother. Celeste had been gone for 7 years. Maureen still caught herself reaching for the phone some evenings to call her. She still knew exactly what her mother's voice sounded like when she was proud of something. A low, warm sound, like someone setting down something heavy, very gently. She could hear it now, in the dark of the car. Tu as bien fait. You did right. She had not yelled. She had not made a scene. She had not given him the satisfaction of a reaction he could dismiss as emotional or excessive. She had said one true thing, in the language he thought she didn't know, and she had said it the way her mother had taught her to say anything that mattered. Calmly, directly, without apology. She had refused to shrink. The Queensway was clear at this hour, the snowplows having done their work. The city quiet the way it gets in winter after midnight. Maureen took the exit toward Vanier and turned on her street and pulled into the driveway of the house she'd bought 11 years ago, when people in her life had said the market was wrong and the timing was bad, and various other things that had not turned out to be as true as they'd expected. She sat in the car for a moment after she turned off the engine. The heat ticked. The snow came down, soft and even. She thought about the new girl, Tamsin, who'd started last month. 24, smart, quick on her feet, a little uncertain in that particular way that young people sometimes are when a room is trying to make them feel like they don't belong in it. Maureen had been watching her, not intrusively, but the way you watch someone, you recognize something of yourself in. She'd been meaning to say something to her. To pass along the particular piece of information her mother had given her, the one that had taken Maureen herself most of her career to fully understand. Not the French, not the language. The other thing, the difference between what you know and what you reveal. The discipline of the wall, and when to open it. The understanding that your composure, in a room that would prefer you to break, is the most powerful thing you own. She'd talked to her Thursday. The following week, on a Wednesday afternoon, a woman named Elfrida Danso called Chateau Belmont and spoke to Bertrand Ouellet. Elfrida ran a catering company that handled large events for federal departments and crown corporations. She had been referred to the restaurant by a contact at Global Affairs, a contact who had mentioned, without going into detail, that Chateau Belmont had good people who knew how to handle difficult situations with grace. Elfrida was looking for an experienced service professional who might be interested in leading the front-of-house team for a series of high-profile dinners over the spring. Government ministers, international delegations, the kind of table where the ability to move smoothly across languages without calling attention to it was not a bonus, but a requirement. Bertrand listened. He said he thought he knew someone. He said he would mention it. He found Maureen before her shift on Thursday. She listened to him describe the offer. The compensation was significant. The work was complex, and the stakes were higher than a restaurant setting, which meant the margin for error was smaller, but also that the recognition, when it came from a different level. She asked if he was recommending it. He said he was recommending her. What she did with that was her call. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to put on her service jacket. Then she said yes. There is something that gets said sometimes, in rooms like Chateau Belmont, about the people who work there. That the real skill isn't in the food or the wine or the table side manner, though those things matter. The real skill is in knowing what a room needs and giving it that without making the room aware of the work behind it. It looks effortless because the effort is invisible. And the effort is invisible because the person doing it decided, a long time ago, that the work was worth doing well, regardless of whether anyone noticed. Douglas Harrington had sat at table 9 and looked at Maureen Osei-Baptiste and seen a woman who was easy to overlook. He had not looked carefully enough. He had not understood that the woman setting down his water glass, with both hands steady, and her posture straight, and her expression perfectly composed, had spent 23 years building exactly that composure. That she had built it the way her mother had built her business, slowly, without shortcuts, in a world that made things harder than they needed to be, and expected her to act grateful for whatever it allowed her. He had not understood that the woman who looked like she was just getting by was, in fact, thriving. That she owned her house. That she had sent her daughter to Carleton on a combination of savings and a bursary Maureen had applied for on her behalf after doing 2 weeks of research at the kitchen table. That she spoke 4 languages and had read more books about French history than most people who taught it. That she had been described by 3 different head chefs over her career as the best front-of-house professional they had ever worked with. He had looked at her and seen a surface. The mistake, if you wanted to call it that, was not an unusual one. It was just an expensive one. Tamsin started to find her footing in February. Maureen had said very little directly. A word here, a correction there. The occasional look across a room that contained a full sentence compressed into a single expression. But she had also, one night after service, sat with Tamsin in the break room and told her the thing about the wall. What it was for. Why you built it. What it was not. It was not submission. It was not surrender. It was not pretending the bad thing wasn't bad. It was a choice about timing, about terrain, about deciding when and how you used what you knew. Tamsin had listened carefully. She was young enough that some of it would take years to settle fully into place. But she had listened. And she had asked one question, which was, how do you know when to open it? Maureen had thought about it. She said, you know. When the moment is right, you know. Because it feels less like anger and more like clarity, like a window opening. Tamsin had nodded slowly. Maureen thought about her mother, and the sewing kit, and the dictionary, and all the words her mother had learned in a language that had not been built for her, and had used anyway, cleanly and without flinching, until they were entirely her own. Some things are not inherited in a single moment. They travel through time the way water travels through rock, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly the shape of the rock is different and you can't say exactly when it changed. Maureen Osei-Baptiste had received something from her mother that could not be taken away from her. And one Thursday evening in November, in a restaurant on the 4th floor of a building in Ottawa, she had passed a small piece of it forward. The city kept snowing. The rooms kept filling. The work kept asking everything she had. She kept giving it.